At 11:52 on the morning of June 18, 1979, in Deadwood, South Dakota, the first angel moved. No one at the burial saw it happen. They heard it instead. A slow scrape of stone against a stone, low enough to be mistaken for the complaint of the coffin rig, long enough to make the 6 pallbearers stop with their gloved hands still on the straps. The sound came from 30 yards uphill, where a weathered limestone angel stood over the Bruin family plot, with its hands crossed at the breast and its blind face turned east. When the scrape ended, the angel was looking downhill. It was looking at the open grave. Walter Creel was the only person who checked his watch. He had repaired watches in Deadwood for 26 years, and he had developed the habit of consulting time whenever a room fell silent. The sweep hand on his steel-cased Bulova passed 11:53. Around him, black coats tightened in the warm mountain wind. The minister lowered his prayer book. A meadowlark called once from the fence and did not call again. The dead man in the coffin was Armand Weller, a retired school custodian whom Walter had known well enough to greet, but not well enough to mourn. The grave had been cut beside Weller's wife in the newer South Terrace of Pilgrim's Rest Cemetery. Nothing about it should have concerned the old angel uphill. Yet the statue's lowered face now seemed aimed precisely at the rectangle of raw earth, as if the burial had been arranged for its inspection. Beth Lark, the cemetery superintendent, climbed the slope in her work shoes. She was a compact woman of 60 with white hair pinned flat beneath a dark hat, and she carried herself with the stubborn balance of someone accustomed to ice, mud, and grieving families. She placed both palms against the angel's base. The limestone did not tremble. The mortar around the plinth was whole. "Wind cannot turn 800 pounds, Walter said quietly. Beth gave him a look meant to keep the sentence from spreading. At 11:59, the coffin began to descend. The winch groaned. The widow's sons watched the polished lid slip below the green carpet that covered the frame. Walter heard another sound from uphill. This one was sharper. A small crack, like a plate breaking in another room. The minute hand reached 12. The grave closed. The walls of earth did not collapse inward. They folded. Walter saw the cut edges bow toward one another, with the neatness of doors closing on hidden hinges. The straps snapped taut. The lowering frame jumped 6 inches, dragging 2 pallbearers to their knees. A seam of black soil met over the coffin lid and pressed itself smooth. Grass from the 2 sides braided across the center, root to root, until the grave looked as if no shovel had touched it in 20 years. One of the widow's sons screamed that his father was still on the straps. He was. The nylon straps descended through the unbroken sod as if the ground had grown around them. Beth seized a shovel and struck the surface. The blade rang, not thudded. Rang. The widow fainted. The minister backed away without finishing the prayer. Men ran for pry bars, picks, and the cemetery backhoe. Walter stayed where he was, staring at the faint line that remained in the grass. The line was curved at both ends. It resembled a closed eyelid. Then the angel uphill turned its head another inch. By 12:10, the burial had become an accident. That was the word Sheriff Don Avery used when he arrived in his brown county cruiser. The ground had failed. The lowering frame had shifted. A buried slab, perhaps part of an older retaining structure, had slid under pressure. Avery repeated these explanations with a patience that made them sound official, while the backhoe's bucket struck what the operator swore was solid rock 6 inches below the grass. At 1:15, without warning, the soil softened. The bucket tore through it. The grave reappeared exactly where it had been cut, its walls square, the coffin hanging unharmed from the snapped straps. No slab lay beneath the sod. No stone had sealed it. The only unusual object was a small brass watch case pressed into the dirt at the foot of the grave. Beth slipped it into her pocket before Avery noticed. The funeral resumed at 3, under a sky crowded with thunderheads. The Brune Angel had been turned back east with a chain hoist and a truck. Walter watched the men chalk a line along its base. When he left the cemetery, the Angel's toes were aligned with the mark. At 11 that night, Beth Lark came to his shop carrying the brass case in a handkerchief. Creel clock and radio stood on Lee Street between a boarded tailor shop and a cafe that closed after supper. Its front window held alarm clocks, pocket watches, 2 tabletop radios, and a wooden regulator clock that had kept the same solemn beat since Walter's father opened the business in 1948. The town outside was damp from rain. Neon from a hotel sign blinked red across the ceiling. Beth placed the handkerchief beneath Walter's green-shaded work lamp. The watch was larger than a standard pocket watch and badly corroded. Soil filled the bow. The crystal was missing. Its hands remained beneath a film of mineral stain. Both stopped at 11:53. Walter fitted a loop to his eye. "Back is engraved," Beth said. He turned the case. Under the tarnish, 7 narrow lines had been cut from the rim toward the center. They were not decorative. Each ended in a tiny square, and inside each square was a different initial. LBCNRHAVSCNCJP. Across the center, someone had scratched 3 words with a knife. Not noon yet. Walter removed the back. The movement inside had rusted into a dark mass, but the mainspring remained wound. That was impossible after decades underground. He touched the balance wheel with a probe. The watch gave one loud tick. Both radios in the display window snapped on. Static filled the shop. Beneath it came a dull impact, then another. Walter counted without intending to. 7 knocks. The regulator clock stopped. The red hotel light outside went dark. Every watch on Walter's bench, open, closed, working, broken, settled at 11:53. Beth did not move. "That old rule," she said. "I thought it was cemetery foolishness." "What rule?" She looked toward the front window, as if someone might be standing beyond it. "No grave open in the north ground, when the town whistle sounds noon. The Weller plot is south." The ground disagreed. Walter removed the loop. "How old is the rule?" Beth's answer came after a long silence. "Older than the road. Older than my employment. It was written on the inside of the tool shed door when I was a girl. My father painted over it. It came back through 3 coats. At midnight, the watches began moving again. All except the brass one. Walter kept it under a glass dome on his bench. He did not sleep. He sat in the rear room with coffee going cold beside him and listened to the city settle into the mountain. Trucks passed on wet pavement. Pipes clicked. The regulator resumed its beat with the slow confidence of a heart that had forgotten an interruption. At 7 in the morning, his daughter found him there. Mara Creel was 23 and worked nights as a nursing aide at Black Hills Community Hospital. She wore a denim jacket over her white uniform and carried her shoes in one hand. Her hair smelled faintly of antiseptic and cigarette smoke from the staff lounge, though she did not smoke. She stopped at the sight of him in the glass dome. "You look terrible. A grave closed yesterday. Most of them do. Not by itself." She set her shoes down. Walter told her what had happened. He omitted the fear in Armand Weller's widow's face, and the way the grass had joined like flesh healing too quickly. Mara listened with the cautious attention she had learned to give confused patients. When he finished, she looked at the stopped watch. 11:53, she said. "You noticed? Our medication clock lost 7 minutes yesterday, exactly at noon. Every clock on the second floor did. The wall clock, the nurses' watches, even the timer in central supply." "Did anyone hear anything?" Mara's expression changed. "A man in room 214 said someone was knocking under his bed. He died." at 12:07. Walter looked again at the 7 lines engraved in the brass. By 9, Beth had called from the cemetery. The Brune Angel had turned during the night. It no longer faced east. It faced the north ground, where no burial was scheduled, and where the oldest lots climbed beneath ponderosa pine and chokecherry. Walter closed the shop. He and Mara drove uphill in his faded blue Ford pickup. Morning sunlight sharpened every roof in Deadwood and burned last night's rain from the pavement. Pilgrim's Rest lay beyond the last row of houses, terraced against a steep slope. It was not the famous cemetery tourists asked about. Pilgrim's Rest belonged to local families, old benevolent lodges, church societies, and those who preferred their dead away from sightseers. Beth waited beside the Brune Angel with a carpenter's level and a revolver tucked into the waistband beneath her jacket. The chalk mark at the base remained where the workmen had drawn it. The plinth had not shifted. The statue had turned from the ankles upward. Its sandaled feet still pointed east. Its robe twisted above them in a spiral of stone. Its shoulders faced north. Its head inclined toward a patch of sunken grass between 2 old family plots. Mara whispered, "That wasn't carved that way." "No," Beth said. "It was not." Walter walked to the sunken patch. There was no marker, only a round iron fitting flush with the ground. He brushed away grass and found a glass disc clouded by age. Beneath it, a thin brass pointer lay over a faded dial. "A sundial?" Mara asked. "Not quite." Walter wiped the glass. Around the rim were minute marks, but the sequence began at 11:53 and ended at 12. 7 minutes occupying a full circle. At the center was a keyhole. Behind them, stone scraped stone. A second angel, farther down the hill, turned its face toward the dial. Beth closed the north ground before lunch. Harlan Brune, the cemetery board chairman, arrived with insurance agent Perry Loom and mortician Calvin Dace. Harlan's grandfather had funded a hospital wing and owned the angel that had twisted above the family plot. He dismissed the buried dial as an abandoned irrigation timer and the statue as vandalism, then produced plans for an access road directly across the sunken patch. Mara told him the hospital clocks had lost 7 minutes and a patient had died at 12:07 after hearing knocks beneath his bed. Harlan warned her not to discuss patients in public. Sheriff Avery ordered the north ground cleared, but Harlan watched his wristwatch and did not leave. At 11:51, the iron fitting in the grass clicked. The glass dial rotated under the surface. Its pointer, which had been fixed at 11:53, began to move backward. Walter knelt. The earth beneath his palm was cold despite the sun. "Get away from it," Beth said. The keyhole opened like a pupil. There was no other motion, no crack in the ground, no sound from below. Yet Walter felt the unmistakable pressure of depth, the sensation of standing at the edge of a shaft hidden by thin boards. At 11:53, the town whistle blew. It was not supposed to. Deadwood's noon whistle had sounded from the Municipal Works building for generations, but it had never sounded 7 minutes early. The single blast rolled across the valley and climbed the cemetery slope. The sunken grass split down the middle. A grave opened beneath it. The sod peeled back without falling. Earth drew away from 4 smooth walls, revealing a narrow shaft lined with dark planks. At the bottom, perhaps 8 feet down, sat a straight-backed chair. Leather straps hung from its arms. A length of chain crossed the seat. On the chair lay a white object that Walter first took for a folded cloth. Then it lifted its face. It was not a skull. It was a plastered death mask, the kind once made by laying oiled cloth and gypsum over a corpse. Its closed eyes opened. The hollows beneath them were packed with black soil. Perry Loom ran. Calvin Dace crossed himself. Sheriff Avery drew his revolver, and then seemed ashamed of it. Harlan Brune did not move. "Old burial equipment," he said. The Brune angel turned another quarter inch. So did the second angel. The sound traveled through the cemetery as a series of grinding breaths. 5 more statues stood among the north plots. A kneeling girl with stone wings, an angel holding a trumpet, 2 identical sentinels at the Drell crypt, a winged child over the Paris lot, and a tall, veiled figure whose face had been worn blank by weather. One after another, their heads began to pivot toward Harlan. He noticed only when their shadows crossed his shoes. At 12, the municipal whistle sounded again. The grave closed. The chair, chain, and death mask vanished beneath folding walls of earth. The sod met with a hard clap. Harlan leaped back, but the heel of his shoe had crossed the seam. The ground caught it. For one instant he stood trapped, as if the cemetery had seized him by the ankle. Walter and Mara pulled him free. The leather tore. His shoe remained below the grass. From under the sealed ground came 7 slow knocks, then one rapid series, frantic and human. Harlan's face lost its color. No one called it an irrigation timer after that. Sheriff Avery sealed the cemetery and told the newspaper that an unstable subsurface vault had been found. Walter called the municipal works office. Its foreman confirmed that the official whistle had sounded only at 12. The earlier blast had come from the cemetery hill, where no whistle existed. Walter took the brass watch to the back room and compared the initials with old city directories kept in a cabinet his father had bought at an auction. The directories were incomplete, but the 1924 volume listed the trustees of a charitable hospital called St. Hesper House for Miners' Relief. Dr. Leander Brune, medical superintendent. Clara Knoll, matron. Reverend Rufus Bellamy, chaplain. August Venn, treasurer. Solomon Kress, mine liaison. Nathan Creel, clock custodian. Josiah Paris, cemetery secretary. The initials matched. Walter read his father's name 3 times. Nathan Creel had been 19 in 1924. He had apprenticed under the city clockkeeper before opening a repair counter in a drugstore. Walter knew those facts. He knew the scar across Nathan's left thumb came from a tower gear. Knew he had disliked July. Knew he refused to attend funerals scheduled before noon. None of it had seemed connected. On a shelf above the directories stood the wooden regulator clock Nathan had installed when the shop opened. Walter removed the lower panel and examined the pendulum case. A shallow groove had been cut into the inside wall at the exact height of the pendulum bob. 7 vertical marks crossed it. Behind the bob, taped to the wood with cloth adhesive gone brown, was a small steel key. It fit the dial in the cemetery. Mara returned before dusk. When Walter showed her the trustee list and Nathan's key, she accused him of sanding the sharp edges from every family fact. Then she told him the patient who heard knocking had died at 12:07, while his bedside clock remained at 11:53. The abandoned St. Hesper building still stood outside town. It stood 2 miles outside Deadwood on a pine bench above a disused road, long since converted into storage for Black Hills Community Hospital. The main ward had been emptied in 1964 when the new hospital wing opened. Mara had been there once to retrieve bed frames. She remembered painted windows, a locked sunroom, and a row of clocks without hands. They drove out after dark. The access road climbed through pines silvered by moonlight. St. Hesper House appeared beyond a rusted cattle guard, a 3-story brick building with broad porches and a central cupola. Its windows had been boarded from inside. A stone cross stood above the entrance, its arms shortened by lightning or vandalism. Mara had borrowed a ring of maintenance keys. The third opened the service door. Inside, the building smelled of dust, mouse droppings, and the sweet chemical residue of old disinfectant. Their flashlights passed over stacked wheelchairs, iron bedsteads, enamel basins, wooden crutches, and cartons of paper patient gowns. The corridor floor sloped toward the rear, as if the whole building had settled in that direction. Every wall clock they found had no hands, not broken hands. Removed hands. The central pins remained, and around each dial, a pale arc marked the years during which hands had once moved. On the floor below, the first clock, lay 7 tiny screws arranged in a line. "Someone stripped them," Mara said. "Someone wanted no one here to know the time." The locked sunroom occupied the south end of the second floor. Its double doors had been painted shut. Walter cut the paint with his pocket knife while Mara held the light. The steel key from the regulator clock did not fit the door, but Nathan Creel had taught his son how to persuade old ward locks with a filed strip of brass. The doors opened inward. 7 wheelchairs faced the windows. Each chair held a neatly folded gray blanket, a tin meal tray, and a pair of men's shoes placed side by side on the footrests. Leather straps hung from the arms. Dust lay thick on everything except the seats, which were clean. The windows had been painted white. Across them, finger marks had drawn 7 narrow clearings. Through each clearing, a seated person would have been visible from the road below. Mara touched one of the meal trays. "Why leave them like this?" A clock ticked behind the wall. Walter followed the sound to a built-in cabinet. Its shelves contained ledgers swollen with damp. Most pages listed coal deliveries, linen counts, meal portions, and medicine orders. He opened one at random. 7 patients appeared on every page for the month of July 1924. Each received breakfast, broth, supper, laundry, and daily medical attention. Each account was billed to a different mine relief fund. On the final page, all 7 names were crossed out at the same time. 12 noon, July 18th. The notation was in violet ink. Beneath it, a second hand had written, "Observed breathing at 11:53. Orderly refuses certification." The name following the note had been cut from the paper. Mara held the flashlight closer. "Can you read the impression underneath?" Walter angled the page. The missing name had pressed into the sheet below. Emmett Dorr. A knock sounded inside the nearest wheelchair. Mara spun around. The gray blanket on its seat rose as if a man beneath it had taken a breath. Then the second blanket lifted. The third. All 7 swelled over invisible chests. Their shoes turned toward the door. Walter seized the ledger. Mara grabbed his arm. They reached the corridor as the wheelchairs rolled from their row, one by one, their empty wheels squealing under the weight of bodies that could not be seen. At the far end of the hall, a clock struck once. The sound came through the plaster with such force that dust burst from the walls. It was 11:53. Every wheelchair stopped. From beneath the 7 blankets came the voices of men speaking together, dry and exhausted. Not noon yet. The doors of the sunroom slammed shut. Walter and Mara ran. Before dawn, Sheriff Avery opened the hospital records annex for them. 7 official death certificates listed the same date, the same noon hour, and the same traced signature from Emmett Dorr. Earlier nursing notes proved the men had died on separate days between July 19 and July 18th. Yet the meal ledger billed relief funds for their food, laundry, and treatment, until all 7 were declared dead together. The physician, matron, treasurer, mine liaison, chaplain, clock custodian, and cemetery secretary had each signed part of the false record. Avery ordered Pilgrim's Rest closed. Walter took the ledger, the watch, and the trustee names to the Deadwood Pioneer. At 8, the Deadwood Pioneer opened. Its photographer and pressman, Owen Paris, was 31 and skeptical in the energetic way of a man who hoped skepticism would provoke better evidence. His great-grandfather Josiah's initial appeared on the watch, but Owen did not defend him. He led them into the paper's basement, where bound editions occupied shelves between ink drums and broken type cabinets. The issue from July 19th, 1924, contained no article about Emmett Dorr. It did contain a small notice announcing that 7 St. Hesper patients had died within the same merciful hour and would be buried together in separate family plots. The photograph beneath the notice showed 7 coffins aligned in Pilgrim's Rest. 7 angels stood behind them. Every angel faced east. A later photograph, printed July 26th, showed the dedication of the St. Hesper Memorial. The coffins were gone. The same 7 angels now faced inward toward an empty patch of ground. In the center stood the grave chair. A man sat strapped to it, hatless in the noon sun. The caption named him as Emmett Dorr and called the event a public prayer for forgiveness after his confession to falsifying patient care. He did not confess, Mara said. Owen carried the photograph upstairs to the enlarger. Grain spread across the projected image. Faces emerged. Leander Brune holding a document. The matron with one hand on the chair. Reverend Hale raising his palm. August Venn and Solomon Kress beside the open grave. Nathan Creel near the cemetery gate. Josiah Paris at the lowering winch. In the background, the old municipal clock tower was visible above the trees. Walter adjusted the enlarger lens. The clock read 11:53. On Emmett Dorr's lap lay the brass watch. His mouth was open. Even blurred by age, the shape of the words could be read. Not noon yet. Owen made 7 prints. As the final sheet developed in its tray, an 8th figure appeared in the photograph. A young girl stood outside the cemetery fence, gripping the iron bars. She wore a hospital laundry apron and looked directly at the camera. No one had noticed her in the first print. Owen knew the face. Mildred Coe, he said. She lives above the laundromat on Williams Street. She's 90, if she's alive. Mildred Coe was alive, sharp-eyed, and furious that it had taken 55 years for anyone to ask the correct question. Her apartment smelled of starch and boiled coffee. She refused to let Sheriff Avery record her until Walter placed Nathan Creel's steel key on the table. That boy cried after he turned the clock, she said. Does the picture show that? No, Walter answered. Pictures keep what shame permits. Mildred had been 15 and employed in the St. Hesper laundry. She had discovered the first body when Alden Ritt's blanket slipped from the wheelchair. The men were dead, washed, dressed, and strapped upright each morning before a relief fund inspector drove the valley road. At night, they were stored in a cold room behind the laundry. Emmett Dorr, the night orderly, found her there and made her promise to stay silent until he could bring a state official from Rapid City. Leander Brune learned of the plan. The trustees seized Emmett before dawn on July 18th. They told the town that the orderly had falsified care records and poisoned the men to conceal his theft. At Pilgrim's Rest, they strapped him to the chair and demanded he sign a confession. They promised that if he refused, they would frighten him only until noon and lift him out before the grave was filled. Emmett refused. The angels were turned so the dead men could witness against him, Mildred said. That was Reverend Hale's idea. He said Stone had no preference and therefore could not lie. What did Nathan do? Walter asked. Leander told him to move noon forward, 7 minutes, 1 for each account. Nathan climbed the tower. The whistle sounded at 11:53, and Josiah Paris released the fillboards. Walter saw the scene without wanting to. Earth sliding from platforms, Emmett's face lifting toward a sun that had not reached its promised place, trustees stepping back from dust, 7 angels staring inward. Did anyone try to stop it? I screamed from the fence. Nathan ran downhill. He reached the grave after the first boards emptied. He dug with his hands until Leander struck him, but the others finished. Why wasn't the body recovered? Mildred looked at Walter with contempt, softened only by age. Because your father repaired the clock afterward. He made the town agree it had been noon. She rose and went to a wardrobe. From beneath folded towels, she removed a narrow strip of yellowed canvas. It had once been part of a laundry sack. 7 circles were drawn on it around a central square. Emmett made this the night before. He understood what they were planning, not the burial. The witness circle. Inside each circle, he had written a sentence. The physician must admit the men were dead before July 18th. The matron must admit she dressed the dead for display. The treasurer must admit he accepted payment for their days. The mine agent must admit he inspected blankets instead of faces. The chaplain must admit Stone was commanded to lie. The clockkeeper must admit noon was moved. The cemetery secretary must admit he closed the grave before the promise. At the bottom was a final line. Truth must occupy the stolen minutes, or the ground will take witnesses of its own. The angels aren't the dead men, Mara said. No, Mildred replied. They are the 7 liars. Stone remembers the direction it was made to face. Walter asked why the curse had waited until 1979. Mildred pointed at the steel key. It did not wait. Every few years the grave opened. The families kept it quiet. They made sure no burial stood open at noon. They reset the dial under the grass and turned the angels back with machinery. But the dial was locked with Nathan's key. When he died, it should have passed to the cemetery. He hid it in the shop. Then the circle remained unwound. Harlan Brune's access road survey had driven a steel stake through the glass housing. The broken mechanism had begun its final cycle. 7 days. 1 angel for each day. At the end, all 7 statues would face the grave, and the ground would close at noon on living witnesses chosen from the families and institutions that had continued to benefit. What happens to someone taken? Avery asked. Mildred did not answer directly. In 1951, a cemetery laborer fell in when the grave opened. They heard him knocking for 7 minutes after it closed. When they dug him out, the chair was empty. So was his body. Only his shadow came home. His wife saw it cross the wall every noon for the rest of her life. Walter thought of the rapid knocking under the sod. We have 5 days, Mara said. 4, Mildred corrected. The first angel turned before the funeral. Today, 2 are facing. By Sunday, 7. Harlan Brune rejected every part of the account when Avery confronted him. He admitted his family had funded St. Hesper House and that the old cemetery custom existed, but he called Mildred vindictive and the photographs misleading. He demanded the access road project continue. The following morning, Walter closed his shop to the public. On the door, he placed a card that read, "Family Matter." It was the phrase Nathan had used whenever shame entered the house. Mara tore it down. "This is not a family matter," she said. That is how they kept it alive. Together, they began calling every place that gave Deadwood its public time. The municipal whistle, the high school clocks, the hospital master clock, the radio station's noontime signal, the courthouse chime, church clocks, the fire station siren test. Walter explained only that an old cemetery hazard required 7 minutes of silence on Sunday. Some officials agreed because Sheriff Avery asked. Others refused until Avery threatened to close their buildings. The radio station manager laughed. Harlan Brune owned a controlling share. By Friday, 4 angels faced the grave. Shops closed their doors from 11:50 to 12:10, and every photograph taken in the cemetery showed 7 long shadows converging on the sunken dial. Harlan called the cemetery board into the municipal hall and proposed removing the statues before Sunday. Walter laid Emmett's witness circle beside the meal ledger. Calvin Dace admitted that his grandfather had operated the lowering winch. Perry Loom admitted his agency still administered money descended from the St. Hesper Trust. The hospital bore the Brune name. The city still used the clock system Nathan Creel had maintained, and the proposed road would profit the cemetery. The old crime had outlived its criminals because its benefits had outlived them. Harlan refused to participate in what he called a public spectacle. A stone angel carved above the hall's cornerstone turned its face downward. 7 chairs slid from the table and formed a circle under invisible weight. The room's clock struck 12 at 11:53, bursting one fluorescent tube with each stroke. When the lights returned, Harlan's chair was empty. They found him at St. Hesper House the next morning, strapped into the center wheelchair with 6 empty chairs around him. He remembered covered men asking the time and tightening the straps whenever he answered noon. At dawn, a 6th cemetery angel turned, and the first survey stake vanished into an opening that had no bottom. Harlan canceled the excavation. Walter gathered the 7 living witnesses that evening. Harlan would speak for the physician and hospital founders, Mara for the matron's office, Perry Loom for the treasurer and surviving trust, Glenn Kress for the mine interests, Reverend Lemuel Shaw for the chaplain, Calvin Dace for the cemetery, and Walter for the clock keeper. None had committed the original murder. Each occupied a place that still received its shelter. Mildred ended their objections. "You are not being asked whether you killed him. You are being asked whether you will keep receiving the minute bought by his death." Walter gathered the 7 witnesses in the cemetery office Saturday evening. Rain tapped the windows, though the sky beyond the glass was clear. The weather radio reported no storm within 50 miles. Harlan Brune would speak for the physician and the hospital founders. Mara, as the employee who had first acknowledged the repeating deaths in the present hospital, would speak for the matron's office. Perry Loom would speak for the treasurer and the surviving relief trust. Glenn Kress, grandson of the mine liaison and retired manager of a local ore hauling concern, would speak for the companies that had paid without looking. Reverend Lemuel Shaw would speak from the place once occupied by the chaplain. Calvin Dace would speak for the cemetery office. Walter would speak for the clock keeper. Each resisted for a different reason. Glenn Kress insisted he had been born 16 years after the burial. Perry Loom feared lawsuits against clients long dead. Reverend Shaw objected to confessing another minister's sin in a cemetery rather than a church. Calvin Dace had spent 30 years burying people and could not bear to say that his family had once used burial as a weapon. Mara feared the hospital would dismiss her. Harlan feared the name Brune would become a synonym for fraud. Walter feared something simpler, that Nathan Creel had not been forced to advance the clock, only asked. Mildred settled the argument. "You are not being asked whether you killed him," she said. "You are being asked whether you will keep receiving the minute bought by his death." She laid Emmett's canvas witness circle on the desk. The plan depended upon silence. At noon Sunday, no public clock in Deadwood could announce the hour until 12:07. The municipal whistle timer would be disconnected. The courthouse chime would be held. The radio station would broadcast 7 minutes of dead air. Churches agreed not to ring. The hospital would stop its master clock at 11:59. The high school clocks were shut down for summer. Owen printed a front-page request asking residents to unplug alarms, silence radios, and refrain from sounding car horns between noon and 12:07. He did not explain why. Some residents mocked the request. Most complied. Deadwood had lived long enough with unexplained rules to recognize when one had reached the surface. Walter spent the night repairing the brass watch. Rust had destroyed the ordinary works, but the mechanism beneath was not ordinary. 7 concentric springs had been fitted inside the case, each tensioned against the next. Nathan Creel had built it after the burial, perhaps as a lock for the underground dial, perhaps as a penance. When Walter cleaned the plates, words appeared along their edges. First minute, the body. Second, the labor. Third, the money. Fourth, the witness. Fifth, the blessing. Sixth, The hour. 7th. The Earth. The watch could not run forward from 11:53. Its minute hand struck an invisible resistance. Walter understood that it would move only as the 7 truths were spoken. At dawn Sunday, every angel in Pilgrim's Rest faced inward, except the trumpet bearer. Its head remained east, but a fracture had opened along its neck. At 11:20, the witnesses assembled at the grave. Avery closed the cemetery gate. Beth stationed the laborers beyond the fence. Owen set up a cassette recorder, but kept his camera packed away. Mildred sat beneath a pine with Emmett's canvas across her knees. The sky was cloudless. Sunlight fell hard on the granite markers and bleached the grass. No wind moved. From town below came the ordinary sounds of a Sunday nearing noon. A truck changing gears, screen doors closing, a dog barking, a radio playing through an open window. At 11:45, the dog stopped. At 11:50, the radio went silent. At 11:53, the trumpet angel turned. Stone split at its neck. Its face swung toward the grave, and the trumpet lowered from its lips until the bell pointed at Walter. The glass dial in the grass unlocked. Walter inserted Nathan's steel key. It turned without resistance. Beneath the glass, the pointer swept once around the 7-minute circle. The grave opened. This time, the shaft had no visible bottom. 7 wheelchairs hung in darkness below, arranged one beneath another, as if descending a stair. Blankets covered their occupants. At the deepest point, Harlan Brune sat strapped to the grave chair, although the real Harlan stood beside Walter at the rim. The figure below wore his face with its eyes closed. Emmett Dorr stood behind the chair. He was not skeletal. He appeared as he had in the 1924 photograph, lean, dust-covered, sleeves rolled, hair flattened by sweat. Soil filled the seams of his clothes. His hands rested on the chair back. When he looked up, Walter saw that his eyes reflected the cemetery as it had been 55 years earlier. The trees were younger. The angels were clean. Nathan Creel knelt at the edge, clawing earth with bloody hands. Walter's father looked up from the reflection and saw him. "Dad?" Mara whispered. Walter had leaned too far over the rim. The grave pulled him in. He did not fall. The sunlight lengthened beneath his feet and became a staircase of narrow shadows. He descended past the 7 wheelchairs while voices spoke through the blankets. Alden Ritt said he had died on July 2nd, with Mildred washing the coal dust from his hands. Morris Kay said he had died on Independence Day while fireworks sounded in town. Samuel Brack said the matron had buttoned his shirt after rigor had stiffened his arms. Peter Loam said a relief inspector waved to him from the road, and the dead were made to wave back by strings tied to their wrists. Edwin Jess said the Wino chaplain prayed over the living accounts, not the dead men. Frank Varney said his daughter received a letter describing meals he never ate. Hugh Paul said Emmett Dorr had closed his eyes each night and opened them each morning so the hospital could sell another day. Walter reached the bottom. The grave was wider there, a room paneled in compressed soil. Roots ran across the ceiling in the pattern of clock gears. The original chair stood at its center. Emmett's remains sat strapped upright, bones held inside the collapsed shape of his clothing. The brass watch chain still crossed his vest. Around him, 7 tin meal trays had been pressed into the walls like the numbers on a clock face. The living image of Emmett placed one hand over the skeleton's mouth. "Do not let them call silence mercy," he said. Above, the town waited. At 12, nothing sounded. No whistle, no chime, no radio tone, no church bell. For the first time since July 18th, 1924, Deadwood reached noon without declaring it. The grave convulsed. Its walls rushed inward a foot, then stopped. The stone angels bent at the waist. Their wings spread with a series of cracks. Dust poured from their mouths. From the empty trumpet came the beginning of a note, but Reverend Shaw seized the stone bell with both hands, as if holding shut a human throat. Mara stepped to the rim. "The men were dead before July 18th, she said. St. Hesper dressed their bodies and displayed them as patients. The hospital sold care it did not give." The first spring inside the watch released. Its mine at hand moved to 11:54. One of the twin angels turned east. The stone over its ears fell away, revealing carved hands no longer hiding them. The grave loosened around Walter's shoulders. At 12:01, Perry Loom spoke. "The treasurer accepted payment for days stolen from the dead. The trust that survived him was built with that money, and my office protected it." The watch advanced to 11:55. A second angel turned east. In town below, the windows of the old bank flashed white, though no cloud crossed the sun. At 12:02, Glenn Kress removed his hat. The mine agent inspected blankets instead of faces, because dead men were cheaper than living claims. The companies paid for an appearance and called it care. The third spring released. The minute hand reached 11:56. The winged child turned away from the grave. The carved blanket in its arms split open and fell in two pieces, empty. The walls around Walter trembled. One of the meal trays came loose and struck the floor. Behind it was a narrow tunnel packed with gray cloth. Hands moved beneath the cloth, pushing outward. At 12:03, Reverend Shaw released the trumpet. Rufus Bellamy blessed a lie and called stone impartial, so that living men would not have to witness what they were doing. No blessing made that grave just. The watch moved to 11:57. The trumpet angel faced east. Its instrument crumbled from its hands. A deep breath passed through the cemetery, carrying the odor of old starch and medicinal alcohol. At 12:04, Calvin Dace began to speak and failed. His mouth opened. No sound came. The grave chair tightened around the living likeness of Harlan below. The walls moved inward another 6 inches. "Say it," Beth shouted. Calvin looked at the grass beneath his polished funeral shoes. "Josiah Parris closed the grave before the promise. The cemetery obeyed money over burial law. My family kept the rule secret and called that protection." The watch advanced to 11:58. The veiled angel turned east. Its stone veil lifted from its face, not falling but peeling backward like fabric in wind. Beneath it was the weathered likeness of Emmett Dorr. Walter could breathe again. At 12:05, it was his turn. He looked up at Mara. Above her shoulder, Nathan Creel still knelt in the reflection inside Emmett's dead eyes. Walter had spent his childhood believing his father's silences were forms of discipline, then his adulthood believing they were grief. Now he understood that Nathan had built an entire life around a mind hand he could not return. Nathan Creel moved noon forward 7 minutes, Walter said. His voice shook. He climbed the tower knowing why they asked. He sounded the whistle. He helped close the grave. He tried to stop it only after obedience became murder. And afterward, he repaired the clock so the town could keep the false hour. The 6th spring released. The watch moved to 11:59. The Brune Angel did not turn. Instead, the kneeling angel beside it rotated east. 6 witnesses had spoken. Harlan remained. At the rim, Harlan stared into the grave at the figure wearing his face. Leander Brune believed St. Hesper would close if the fraud became known, he said. Nothing happened. The walls tightened. That is not the truth, Mildred said. He believed the patients' families would lose their only hospital. The watch remained still. The false Harlan below opened its eyes. They were filled with packed soil. It smiled. "Harlan," Mara said, "you are still defending him?" At 12:06, the radios of Deadwood turned on by themselves. Music, sermons, baseball commentary, static, and advertisements spilled from houses and cars. Every frequency collapsed into one rising tone. The curse had found its own public signal. The angels leaned toward the grave. The ground began to fold. Walter seized Emmett's chair. The bones weighed almost nothing, but the earth held the legs. He pulled until the old wood cracked. Above him, Mara lay flat and reached down. Their fingertips missed. Harlan Brune looked toward the hospital wing his family had named, visible beyond the trees. Then he looked at Mildred. "My grandfather knew those men were dead," he said. "He ordered their bodies washed, dressed, and tied up right. He accused Emmett to preserve his name and income. He ordered the clock changed so he could bury an innocent man before courage reached him. My family knew enough to keep the grave rule, and I knew enough to fear the road crossing it. I chose the road anyway." The seventh spring released. The watch struck 12. Every stone angel turned east. The radio tone broke. The grave wall stopped 1 inch from Walter's back. The roots overhead uncoiled. Sunlight poured down the shaft, not in a beam, but in 7 bright steps. Emmett Doerr's living image lifted the chair. Walter felt the weight leave his hands. The chair rose through him, carrying the remains gently upward. The 7 wheelchairs followed, blankets collapsing as they entered sunlight. At the rim, Mara and Calvin received the chair. Mildred stood despite Avery's attempt to help her and laid the canvas witness circle over Emmett's knees. Walter climbed. At 12:07, he reached the grass. The grave remained open and empty. At its bottom lay only Harlan's missing shoe and 7 clock hands arranged like spokes. Walter turned Nathan's key in the dial. The grave closed. No earth folded. No stone rang. The wall softened, slid inward, and covered the empty shaft with ordinary soil. The sod did not heal across it. A raw rectangle remained under the noon sun, waiting for an honest burial. The angels did not move again. Emmett Doerr was buried 3 days later at 9 in the morning. The town used no chair, no straps, no public clock, and no stone witnesses. Mildred chose the words for the marker. Emmett Doerr, night orderly. He knew 7 men were dead. He said it was not noon. The 7 patient families received corrected records. St. Hesper's remaining trust was dissolved into respiratory care, and the hospital removed the Brune name from its west wing. Harlan resigned from the cemetery board and spent months giving testimony. Perry Loom closed the old accounts. Glenn Kress paid for Emmett's marker. Reverend Shaw recorded the chaplain's part in the church register. Calvin Dace added the true noon prohibition to the public cemetery rules. Mildred Coe died that winter. At her funeral, 7 empty wheelchairs appeared on the St. Hesper porch, all facing east. Owen's photographs of the final noon showed only white fields crossed by black minute hands, but his cassette preserved every confession, with a shovel striking below each voice. Mara kept her hospital job after half the nursing staff threatened to resign with her. She later entered nursing school in Rapid City. Walter dismantled Nathan's regulator clock and found one final sentence behind the pendulum. I heard him after the whistle. He placed it with the county evidence and built a new shop clock that could not strike. For the rest of Walter's life, his right hand stiffened daily at 11:53 and released at 12:07. Pilgrim's Rest never built the access lane. The 7 angels remained on their family plots, facing east, while weather softened their features and birds nested in their empty hands. Years later, children in Deadwood called the unmarked rectangle the Noon Grave, even after Emmett's marker stood at its head. They dared one another to cross it while the municipal whistle prepared to sound. Adults stopped them without explaining. The grave never opened again. But each July 18th, between 11:53 and noon, the 7 angels cast shadows in the wrong direction. The shadows turn from the east, move across the grass, and gather around Emmett Doerr's stone. They do not resemble wings. They resemble men seated in wheelchairs. At 12:07, when every honest clock in Deadwood has passed the hour, the 7 seated shadows rise together. One of them bends toward the ground as if listening. From beneath the grave comes a single knock, not a plea to be released, a warning to anyone who might move noon again